Hello, my friends. It is Indiana Holmes for Story Time, and tonight we continue with our novel, A Damsel in Distress, and we begin with Chapter 8. The following day was a Thursday, and on Thursdays, as has been stated, Belfair Castle was thrown open to the general public between the hours of 2 and 4. It was a tradition long standing, this periodical lowering of the barriers, and had always been faithfully observed by Lord Marshmoreton ever since his ascension to the title. By the permanent occupants of the castle, the day was regarded with mixed feelings. Lord Belpher, while approving of it in theory, as he did of all the family traditions, for he was a great supporter of all things feudal, and took his position as one of the hereditary aristocracy of Great Britain extremely seriously, heartily disliked it in practice, though. More than once he had been obliged to exit hastily by a further door in order to keep from being discovered by a drove of tourists intent on inspecting the library or the great drawing room, and now it was his custom to retire to his bedroom immediately after lunch and not to emerge until the tide of the invasion had ebbed away. Keggs, the butler, always looked forward to Thursdays with pleasurable anticipation. He enjoyed the sense of authority which it gave him to herd these poor outcasts to and fro among their surroundings, which were an everyday commonplace to himself. Also, he liked hearing the sound of his own voice as it lectured in rolling periods on the subjects and objects of interest by the wayside. But even to Keggs there was a bitter mixed with the sweet. No one was better aware than himself that the nobility of his manner, excellent as a means of impressing the mob, worked against him when it came to a question of tips. Again and again had he been harrowed by the spectacle of tourists, huddled together like sheep, debating among themselves in nervous whispers as to whether they could offer this person anything so contemptible as half a crown for himself, and deciding that such an insult was out of the question. It was his endeavor, especially towards the end of the proceedings, to cultivate a manner blending a dignity fitting his position with a sunny geniality which would allay the timid doubts of the tourist and indicate to him that, bizarre as the idea might seem, there was nothing to prevent him placing his poor silver in more worthy hands. Possibly the only member of the castle community who was absolutely indifferent to these public visits was Lord Marshmoreton. He made no difference between Thursday and any other day. Precisely as usual, he donned his stained corduroys and pottered about his lovely garden. And when, as happened on an average once a quarter, some visitor strayed from the main herd, came upon him as he worked and mistook him for one of the gardeners, he accepted the error without any attempt at explanation, sometimes going so far as to encourage it by adopting a rustic accent in keeping with his appearance. This sort of thing tickled the simple-minded peer. George joined the procession punctually at 2 o'clock, just as Keggs was clearing his throat preparatory to saying, "We are now in the main all, and before going any further, I would like to call your attention to Sir Peter Lely's portrait of—" It was his custom to begin his Thursday lectures with this remark, but today it was postponed, for no sooner had George appeared than a breezy voice on the outskirts of the throng spoke in a tone that made competition impossible. "For goodness' sake, George!" And Billy Dore detached herself from the group. A trim vision in blue, she wore a dust coat and motor veil, and her eyes and cheeks were glowing from the fresh air. "For goodness' sake, George, what are you doing here? I was just going to ask you the same thing." "Oh, I motored down with a boy I know. We had a breakdown just outside the gates. we were on our way to Brighton for lunch. He suggested I should pass the time seeing the sights while he fixed up the sprockets or the differential gear or whatever it was. He's coming to pick me up when he's through. But on the level, George, how do you get this way? You sneak out of town and leave for the show flat? And nobody has a notion where you are? Why, we were thinking of advertising for you. Or going to the police or something. For all anybody knew, you might have been sandbagged or dropped in the river. This aspect of the matter had not occurred to George till now. His sudden descent on Belpher had seemed to him the only natural course to pursue. He had not realized that he would be missed, and that his absence might have caused grave inconvenience to a large number of people. I never thought of that. I just happened to come here. You aren't living in this old castle. Not quite. I have a cottage down the road. I wanted a few days in the country, so I rented it. But what made you choose this place? Keggs, who had been regarding these disturbers of peace with dignified disapproval, coughed. If you would not mind, madam, we are waiting. What's that? Miss Dorr looked up with a bright smile. I'm sorry. Come along, George. Get in the game. She nodded cheerfully to the butler. All right, all set now. You may fire when ready, Gridley. Keggs bowed austerely and cleared his throat again. We are now in the main all, and before going any further, I would like to call your attention to Sir Peter Lely's portrait of the 5th Countess, said by experts to be in his best manner. There was an almost soundless murmur from the mob, expressive of wonder and awe, like a gentle breeze rustling leaves. Billy Dorr resumed her conversation in a whisper. Yes, there was an awful light of excitement when they found that you had disappeared. They were phoning the Carlton every 10 minutes trying to get you. You see, the summertime number flopped on the second night, and they hadn't anything to put in its place. But it's all right. They took it out and sewed up the wound, and now you'd never know there had been anything wrong. The show was 10 minutes too long anyway. How's the show going? It's a riot. They think it will run for 2 years in London, as far as I can make it out. You don't call it a success in London unless you can take your grandchildren to see the 1000th night. That's splendid. And how's everybody? All right? Fine. That fellow Gray is still hanging around Babe. It beats me what she sees in him. Anybody but an infant could see the man wasn't on the level. Well, I don't blame you for quitting London, George. This sort of thing is worth 50 Londons. The procession had reached one of the upper rooms, and they were looking down from a window that commanded a sweep of miles of countryside, rolling and green and wooded. Far away beyond the last covert Belpher Bay gleamed like a streak of silver. Billy Dorr gave a little sigh. There's nothing like this in the world. I'd like to stand here for the rest of my life, just lapping it up. I will call your attention, boomed Keggs at their elbow, to this window, known as the Fimley tradition, as Leonard's Leap. Yes, that's what they call it, Leonard's Leap. It was in the year 1787 that Lord Leonard IV, eldest son of His Grace, the Duke of Launchlane, hurled himself out the window in order to avoid compromising the beautiful Countess of Marshmoreton, with whom he is related to have had an innocent romance. Surprised at an advance hour by his lordship, the Earl, in her ladyship's boudoir, as the room then was, he leaped through the window into the boughs of the cedar tree which stands below, and was fortunate enough to escape with a few harmless contusions. A murmur of admiration greeted the recital of the ready tact of this 18th century Steve Brodie. There, said Billy enthusiastically, that's exactly what I mean about this country. It's just a mass of Leonard Leaps and things. I'd like to settle down in this sort of place and spend the rest of my life milking cows and taking forkfuls of soup to the deserving villagers. We will now said Keggs, hurting the mob with a gesture. Proceed to amber drawing room, containing some goblin tapestries, highly spoken of by connoisseurs. The obedient mob began to drift out in his wake. "What do you say, George?" asked Billy in an undertone, "if we sidestep the amber drawing room? I'm wild to get into that garden. There's a man working among those roses. Maybe he would show us around." George followed her, pointing finger. Just below them, a sturdy, brown-faced man in corduroys was pausing to light a stubby pipe. "Just as you like." They made their way down the great staircase, the voice of Keggs saying complimentary things about the goblin tapestry came to their ears like the roll of distant drums. They wandered out towards the rose garden. The man in corduroys had lit his pipe and was bending once more to his task. "Well, Dada," said Billy amiably, "how are the crops?" The man straightened himself up. He was a nice-looking man of middle age, with kind eyes and a friendly dog. He smiled genially and started to put his pipe away. Billy stopped him. "Don't stop smoking on my account," she said. "I like it. Well, you've got the right sort of job, haven't you? If I was a man, there is nothing I'd better do than to put my 8 hours in a rose garden." She looked about her. "And this," she said with approval, "is just what a rose garden ought to be." "Are you fond of roses, missy?" "You bet I am. You must have every kind here that was ever invented, all 57 varieties." "There are nearly 3,000 varieties," said the man in the corduroys tolerantly. "I was speaking colloquially, Dada. You can't teach me anything about roses. I'm the guy that invented them. Got any Ashires?" The man in corduroys seemed to have come to the conclusion that Billy was the only thing on earth that mattered. This revelation of a kindred spirit had captured him completely. George was merely among those present. "Those them over there are Ashires, missy." "We don't get Ashires in America. At least I never ran across them. I suppose they do have them." "You want the right soil." "You must have the right soil. Clay and lots of rain." "You're right." There was an earnest expression in Billy Dore's face that George had never seen before. "Say, listen, Dada, in this matter of rose beetles, what would you do if—" George moved away. The conversation was becoming too technical for him, and he had an idea that he would not be missed. There had come to him, moreover, in a flash, one of those sudden inspirations which made great generals get. He had visited the castle this afternoon without any settled plan, other than a vague hope that he might somehow see Maud. He now perceived that there was no chance of doing this. Evidently on Thursdays the family went to earth and remained hidden until the sightseers had gone. But there was another avenue of communication open to him. This gardener seemed to be an exceptionally intelligent man. He could be trusted to deliver a note to Maud. In his late rambles about Belpher Castle in the company of Keggs and his followers, George had been privileged to inspect the library. It was an easy accessible room, opening off the main hall. He left Billy and her new friend deep in a discussion of slugs and plant lice, and walked quickly back to the house. The library was unoccupied. George was a thorough young man. He believed in leaving nothing to chance. The gardener had seemed a trustworthy soul, but you never knew. It was possible that he drank. He might forget to lose the precious note. So, with a wary eye on the door, George hastily scribbled it on a duplicate. This took him but a few minutes. He went out into the garden again to find Billy Dore on the point of stepping into a blue automobile. "Oh, there you are, George. I wondered where you had got to. Say, I made quite a hit with Dada. I've given him my address, and he's promised to send me a whole lot of roses. By the way, shake hands with Mr. Forsyth. This is George Bevan, Freddie, who wrote the music for our show." The solemn youth at the wheel extended a hand. "Topping show, topping music, topping all around. Well, goodbye, George. See you soon, I suppose. Oh, yes, give my love to everybody. All right. Let her rip, Freddie. Goodbye. Goodbye." The blue car gathered speed and vanished down the drive. George returned to the man in the corduroys who had bent himself double in pursuit of a slug. "Just a minute," said George hurriedly. He pulled out the first of the notes. "Give this to Lady Maud the first chance you get. It's important. Here's a sovereign for your trouble." He hastened away. He noticed that gratification had turned the other nearly purple in the face, and was anxious to leave him. He was a modest young man, and effusive thanks always embarrassed him. There now remained the disposal of the duplicate one. It was hardly worth while, perhaps, taking such a precaution, but George knew that victories are won by those who take no chances. He had wandered perhaps 100 yards from the rose garden when he encountered a small boy in the buttoned uniform of a page. The boy appeared from behind a big cedar, where, as a matter of fact, he had been smoking a stolen cigarette. "Do you want to earn half a crown?" asked George. The market value of messengers had slumped. The stripling held out his hand. "Give this note to Lady Maud." "Right-o." "See that it reaches her at once." George walked off with the consciousness of a good day's work done. Albert, the page, having bitten his half-crown, placed it in his pocket, then hurried away, a look of excitement and gratification in his deep blue eyes. Chapter 9. While George and Billy Dore wandered to the rose garden to interview the man in corduroys, Maud had been seated 100 yards away in a very special haunt of her own. A cracked stucco temple set up in the days of the Regency on the shores of a little lily-covered pond. She was reading poetry to Albert the page. Albert the page was a recent addition to Maud's inner circle. She had interested herself in him some 2 months back in much the same spirit as a prisoner in a dungeon cell tames the conventional mouse. To educate Albert, to raise him above his groove in life, and develop his soul, appealed to her romantic nature as a worthy task and as a good way of filling in the time. It is an exceedingly moot point, and one which his associates of the servants' hall would have combated hotly whether Albert possessed a soul. The most one could say for certain is that he looked as if he possessed one. To one who saw his deep blue eyes and their sweet soul, pensive expression, as they searched the middle distance, he seemed like a young angel. However, how was the watcher to know that the thought behind the far-off gaze was simply a speculation as to whether the bird in the cedar tree was or was not within range of his catapult? Certainly Maud had no such suspicion. She worked hopefully day by day to rouse Albert to an appreciation of the nobler things in life. Not but what it was a tough going. Even she admitted that. Albert's soul did not soar readily. It refused to leap from the earth. His reception of the poem could have scarcely been called encouraging. Maud finished it in a hushed voice, and looked pensively across the dappled water of the pool. A gentle breeze stirred the water lilies, so that they seemed to sigh. "Isn't it beautiful, Albert?" she said. Albert's blue eyes lit up. His lips parted eagerly. "That's the first hornet I've seen all year," he said, pointing. Maud felt a little damped. "Haven't you been listening, Albert?" "Oh, yes, milady." "Ain't he a whopper, too?" "Never mind the hornet, Albert. Very good, milady." "I wish you wouldn't say, 'very good, milady.' It's like... She paused. She had been about to say that it was like a butler, but she reflected regretfully. It was probably Albert's dearest ambition to be like a butler. It doesn't sound right. Just say yes. "Yes, milady." Maud was not enthusiastic about the milady, but she let it go. After all, he had not quite settled in her mind what exactly she wished Albert's attitude toward herself to be. Broadly speaking, she wanted him to be like as he could be to a medieval page, one of those silk and satin little treasures she had read about in Ingoldsby's Legends. And of course, they presumably said "Milady," and yet she felt not for the first time that it is not easy to revive the Middle Ages in these curious days. Pages, like other things, seem to have changed since then. That poem was written by a very clever man who married one of the ancestresses. He ran away with her from this very castle in the 17th century. Lore, said Albert as a concession. But he was still interested in the hornet. He was far below her in the eyes of the world, but she knew what a wonderful man he was, so she didn't mind what people said about her marrying beneath. Like Susan when she married policeman. Who was Susan? Red-headed girl. That used to be a cook here. Mr. Keggs he says, "You're marrying beneath you, Susan." He says, I was just listening to the door. And she says, "Oh, go and boil your fat head," she says. This translation of a favorite romance into terms of servants' hall chilled Maud to a cold shower. She recoiled from it. "Wouldn't you like to get a good education, Albert?" she said perseveringly, "and become a great poet and write wonderful poems?" Albert considered the point and shook his head. "No, milady." It was discouraging, but Maud was a girl of pluck. You cannot leap into strange cabs in Piccadilly unless you have pluck. She picked up another book from the stone. "Read me some of this," she said, "and then tell me if it doesn't make you feel you want to do big things." Albert took the book cautiously. He was getting a little fed up with all this sort of thing. True, her ladyships gave him chocolates to eat during these sessions, but for all that, it was too much like school for his taste. He regarded the open page with disfavor. Go on," said Maud. "Close your eyes. It's very beautiful." Albert began. He had a husky voice, due, it is to be feared, to precocious cigarette smoking, and his enunciation was not as good as it might have been. He went on like this: "We've blixt Morris the flower ports, were crusted oral, they rusted niles fell from the knots, that aired a pair in the garden wall. Their broken sheds looked shed and string, uplifted was clinking latch, weeded and worn their ancient thatch, or upon their lonely moated gringe. She only said, me life is dreary, he cometh not," she said. Albert rather liked this part. He was never happy in narrative unless it could be sprinkled with a plentiful supply of he saids and she saids. He finished with some gusto. "She said, I'm weary. I would that I was dead." Maud had listened to this rendition of one of her most adored poems with much the same feeling which a composer with an oversensitive ear would suffer on hearing his pet opus assassinated by a schoolgirl. Albert, who was a willing lad and prepared, if such should be desired, to plough his way through the entire 7 stanzas, began the second voice, but Maud gently took the book away from him. Enough was sufficient. "Now, wouldn't you like to be able to write a wonderful thing like that, Albert?" "Not me, milady." "You wouldn't like to be a poet when you grow up?" Albert shook his golden head. "I want to be a butcher when I grow up, milady." Maud uttered a little cry. "A butcher?" "Yes, milady. Butchers earn good money," he said, a light of enthusiasm in his blue eyes, for he was now on his favorite subject. "You've got to 'ave some meat. You see, milady, I ain't like poetry, milady, which no one wants." "But Albert," cried Maud faintly, "killing poor animals, surely you wouldn't like to do that?" Albert's eyes glowed softly, as might an acolyte's at the sight of the censer. "Mr. Wiggin, down at one of the farms," he murmured reverently. "He says if I'm a good boy, he'll let me watch him kill a pig Tuesday." He gazed out over the water lilies, his thoughts far away. Maud shuddered. She wondered if medieval pages were ever quite as earthly as this. "Perhaps you had better go now, Albert. They may be needing you in the house." "Very good, milady." Albert rose, not willing to call it a day. He was conscious of the need for a quiet cigarette. He was fond of Maud, but a man can't spend all of his time with the women. "Pigs squeal like a billy-o, milady," he observed by way of adding a parting treasure to Maud's stock of general knowledge. "Ooh, 'ear 'em a mile off, you can." Maud remained where she was, thinking a wistful figure. Tennyson's Mariana always made her wistful, even when rendered by Albert. In the occasional moods of sentimental depression which came to vary her normal cheerfulness, it seemed to her that the poem might have been written with a prophetic eye to her special case. So nearly did it crystallize in the magic words her own story. With blackest moss, the flower pots were thickly crusted, one and all. Well, no, not that particular part, perhaps. If he had found so much as one flower pot of his even thinly crusted with any foreign substance, Lord Marshmoreton would have gone through the place like the east wind, dismissing gardeners and under gardeners with every breath. But, and it goes on, "She only said my life is dreary. He cometh not," she said. "She said I am weary, weary. I would that I were dead." How exactly at these moments, when she was not out on the links picking them off the turf with her mid-iron, or engaged in one of those other beautiful sports which tend to take the mind off its troubles, those words summed up her case. Why did Geoffrey come, or at least write? She could not write to him. Letters from the castle left only by way of castle post-bag, which Rogers, the chauffeur, took down to the village every evening. Impossible to entrust that kind of letter that she wished to write to any mode of delivery so public, especially now when her movements were watched. To open and read another's letters is a low and dastardly act, but she believed that Lady Caroline would do it like a shot. She longed to pour out her heart to Jeffreys in a long, intimate letter, but she did not dare to take the risk of writing for a wider public. Things were bad enough as it was, after the disastrous sortie to London. At this point, a soothing vision came to her, the vision of George Bevan knocking off her brother Percy's hat. It was the pleasant thing that had happened almost as far back as she could remember, and then, for the first time, her mind condescended to dwell for a moment on the author of that act. George Bevan, the friend in need, whom she had only met the day before in the lane. What was George doing at Belpher? His presence there was significant, and his words were even more so. He had stated explicitly that he wished to help her. She found herself oppressed by the irony of things. A knight had come to the rescue, but the wrong knight. Why could it not have been Geoffrey who waited in ambush outside the castle, and not a pleasant but negligible stranger? Whether deep down in her consciousness she was aware of the fleeting sense of disappointment in Geoffrey, a swiftly passing thought that he had failed her, she could hardly have said. So quickly did she crush it down. She pondered on the arrival of George. What was the use of his being somewhere in the neighborhood if she had no idea of the means of knowing where she could find him. Situated as she was, she could not wander at will around the countryside, looking for him. And even if she found him, what then? There was not much of anything that a stranger, however pleasant, could do. She flushed at the sudden thought. Of course, there was something George could do for her, if he were willing. He could receive dispatch and deliver letters. If only she could get in touch with him, she could, through him, get in touch with Geoffrey. The whole of the world changed. The sun was setting, and the chill in little winds had begun to stir the lily pads, giving a depressing air to the scene, but to Maud it seemed as if all nature smiled. With the egotism of love, she did not perceive what she proposed to ask George to do was practically to fulfill the humble role of the hollow tree in which lovers dump letters, to be extracted later. She did not consider George's feelings at all. He had offered her help, and this was his job. The world was full of Georges, whose task it is to hang about in the background and make themselves unobtrusively useful. She had reached this conclusion when Albert, who had taken a shortcut the more rapidly to accomplish his errand, burst upon her dramatically from the heart of the rhododendron thicket. "Milady, gentlemen, give me this to give to yer." Maud read the note. It was brief and to the point. "I'm staying near the castle at the cottage they call the one down by Platt's. It is a rather new red brick place. You can easily find it. I shall be waiting there for you if you want me." It was signed The Man in the Cab. "Do you know the cottage called the one down by Platt's, Albert?" asked Maud. "Yes, milady. It's down by Platt's farm. I see a chicken killed there every Wednesday week. Do you know, milady, after a chicken's 'ead is off, it goes running lickety-split?" Maud shivered slightly. Albert's fresh young enthusiasm frequently jarred upon her. "I find a friend of mine is staying there. I want you to take a note to him for me." "Very good, milady. And Albert." "Yes, milady. Perhaps it would be as well if you said nothing about this to any of your friends." In Lord Marshmoreton's study, a council of three was sitting in debate. The subject under discussion was that other note which George had written and so ill-advisedly entrusted to one whom he had taken for a guileless gardener. The council consisted of Lord Marshmoreton, looking rather shamefaced, his son Percy, looking swollen and serious, and Lady Caroline Byng, looking like a tragedy queen. This Lord Belpher was saying in a determined voice settles it. From now on, Maud must not be allowed out of our sight. Lord Marshmoreton spoke. "I rather wish," he said regretfully, "I hadn't spoken about the note. I only mentioned it because I thought you might think it amusing." "Amusing?" Lady Caroline's voice shook the furniture. "Amusing that the fellow should have handed me, of all people, a letter for Maud," explained her brother. "I don't want to get Maud into trouble." "You are criminally weak," said Lady Caroline severely. "I really honestly believe that you were capable of giving the note to that poor misguided girl and saying nothing about it." She flushed. The insolence of the man, coming here and settling down at the very gates of the castle. If it was anybody but this man Platt who was giving him shelter, I should insist on his being turned out. But the man Platt would only be too glad to know that he was causing us an annoyance. "Quite," said Lord Belpher. "You must go to this man as soon as possible," continued Lady Caroline, fixing her brother with a commanding stare, "and do your best to make him see how abominable his behavior is." "Oh, I couldn't," pleaded the Earl. "I don't know the fellow. He'd throw me out." "Nonsense! Go at the very earliest opportunity." "Oh, all right. Well, I think I'll be slipping out to the rose garden again now. There's a clear hour before dinner. There was a tap on the door. Alice Faraday entered bearing papers, a smile of sweet helpfulness on her pretty face. I hope I should find you here, Lord Marshmoreton. You promised to go over these notes with me, the ones about the Essex branch. The hunted peer looked as if he were about to dive through the window. Some other time, some other time. I have important matters. Oh, if you're busy. Of course, Lord Marshmoreton would be delighted to work on your notes, Miss Faraday, said Lady Caroline crisply. Take this chair. We are just going. Lord Marshmoreton gave one wistful glance through the open window. Then he sat down with a sigh and felt for his reading glasses. Chapter 10. Your true golfer is a man who, knowing that life is short and perfection hard to attain, neglects no opportunity of practicing his chosen sport, allowing neither wind nor weather nor any external influence to keep him from it. There is a story, with an excellent moral lesson, of a golfer whose wife had determined to leave him forever. Will nothing alter your decision? He says. Will nothing induce you to stay? Well, then, while you're packing, I think I'll go out on the lawn and rub up my putting bit. George Bevan was of this turn of mind. He might be in love. Romance might have sealed him for her own, but that was no reason for binding himself to the fact that his long game was bound to suffer if he neglected to help himself up to the mark. His first act on arriving at Belpher Village had been to ascertain whether there was a links in the neighborhood, and thither, on the morning after his visit to the castle and the delivery of the 2 notes, he repaired. At the hour of the day which he had selected, the clubhouse was empty, and he had just resigned himself to a solitary game, when, with a whir and a rattle, a gray racing car drove up, and from it emerged the same long young man whom, a couple of days earlier, he had seen wriggle out from underneath the same machine. It was Reggie Bing's habit also not to allow anything, even love, to interfere with golf, and not even the prospect of hanging about the castle or the castle grounds in hopes of catching a glimpse of Alice Faraday and exchanging timorous words with her had been enough to keep him from the links. Reggie surveyed George with a friendly eye. He had a dim recollection of having seen him before somewhere, at some time or other, and Reggie had the pleasing disposition which caused him to rank anybody whom he had seen somewhere at some time or other as a bosom friend. "Hello, hello, hello," he observed. "Good morning," said George. "Waiting for somebody?" "No." "How about it, then? Shall we stagger forth?" "Delighted." George found himself speculating upon Reggie. He was unable to place him. That he was a friend of Maud he knew, and guessed he was also a resident of the castle. He would have liked to question Reggie, to probe him, to collect from him inside information as to the progress of the events within the castle walls. But it is a peculiarity of golf, as of love, that it temporarily changes the natures of its victims. And Reggie, a firm babbler off the links, became, while in action, a stern, silent, intent person, his whole being centered on the game, with the exception of a casual remark of a technical nature when he met George on various tees, and an occasional expletive when things went wrong with his ball. He issued conversation. It was not till the end of the round that he became himself again. "If I'd known you were such hot stuff," he declared generously, as George holed his 18th putt from a distance of 10 feet, "I'd have got you to give me a stroke or 2. "I was on my game today," said George modestly. "Sometimes I slice as if I were cutting bread and can't putt to hit a haystack." Let me know when one of those times comes along, and I'll take you on again. I don't know when I've seen anything fruitier than the way you got out of that bunker at the 15th. It reminds me of a match I saw between Reggie and became technical. Reggie just then became technical. At the end of his observations, he climbed into the gray car. Can I drop you anywhere? Thanks, said George. If it's not taking you out of your way. I'm staying at Castle Belfer. I live quite near there. Perhaps you'd care to come in and have a drink on your way. A ripe scheme, agreed Reggie. 10 minutes in the gray car ate up the distance between the links and George's cottage. Reggie Byng passed these minutes in the intervals of eluding carts and foiling the apparently suicidal intentions of some stray fowls, in jerky conversation on the subjects of his iron shots, with which he expressed deep satisfaction. Topping little place, absolutely, was the verdict he pronounced on the exterior of the cottage as he followed George in. I've often thought it would be a rather sound scheme to settle down in this sort of shanty and keep chickens and grow honey colored bread and have soup and jelly brought to you by the vicar's wife and so on and so forth. Nothing to worry you then. Do you live here all alone? George was busy squirting seltzer into his guest's glass. Yes, Mrs. Platt comes in and cooks for me, the farmer's wife next door. An exclamation from the other caused him to look up. Reggie Byng was staring at him wide-eyed. Great Scott, Mrs. Platt! Then you're the chappie. George found himself unequal to the intellectual pressure of the conversation. The chappie? The chappie there's all a row about. The matter was telling me this morning that you lived here. Is there a row about me? Is there what? Reggie's manner became solicitous. I say, my dear old sportsman, I don't want to be the bearer of bad tidings and what not, if you know what I mean. But didn't you know there was a certain amount of angry passion rising about so forth because of you? At the castle, I mean. I don't want to seem to be discussing your private affairs and all that sort of thing. But what I mean is, well, you don't expect you can come charging in the way you have without touching the family on the raw bit. The daughter of the house falls in love with you. The son of the house languishes in choky because he has a row with you in Piccadilly. And on top of that, all you come here and camp out at the castle gates. Naturally, the family are a bit peeved. Only natural, eh? I mean to say, what? George listened to this address in bewilderment. Maud in love with him? It sounded incredible. That it should be love for her after their one meeting was a different thing altogether. That was perfectly natural and in order. But that he should have had the incredible luck to win her affection, the thing struck him as grotesque and ridiculous. In love with me, he cried. What on earth do you mean? Reggie's bewilderment equaled his own. Well, dash it all, old top. It surely isn't news to you. She must have told you. Why, she told me. Told you? Am I going mad? Absolutely. I mean, absolutely not. Look here. Reggie hesitated. The subject was delicate, but once started, it might as well be proceeded with some conclusion. A fellow couldn't go on talking about his iron shots after this just as if nothing had happened. This was just time for laying down the cards, the opening of hearts. I say, you know, he went on, feeling his way, you probably think it deuced rummy of me talking like this. Perfect stranger and whatnot. Don't even know each other's names. Mine's Bevan, if that'll be of any help. Thanks very much, old chap. Great help. Mine's Byng. Reggie Byng. Well, as we're all pals here, and meetings tiled and so forth, I'll start by saying that the mater is most deucedly set on my marrying Lady Maud. Been pals all our lives, you know, children together and all that sort of rot. Now, there's nobody I think more corking sportsman than Maud. if you know what I mean. But this is where the catch comes in. I'm most frightfully in love with somebody else, hopeless, and all that sorts of things. But still, there it is. And all the while, the mater behind me with a brattle, sicking me on to the purpose, on to propose to Maud, who wouldn't have me if I were the only fellow left on earth. You can't imagine, my dear old chap, what a relief it was to both of us when she told me the other day that she was in love with you and wouldn't dream of looking at anybody else. I tell you, I went singing about the place. George felt inclined to imitate his excellent example. A burst of song was the only adequate expression of the mood of heavenly happiness with this young man's revelations, which had been brought to him. The whole world seemed different. Wings seemed to be sprouted from Reggie's shapely shoulders. The air was filled with soft music. Even the wallpaper seemed moderately attractive. He mixed himself a second whiskey and soda. It was the next best thing to singing. I see, he said. It was difficult to say anything. Reggie was regarding him enviously. I wish I knew how the deuce fellow set about making a girl fall in love with him. Other chappies seem to do it, but I can't even start. She seems to sort of gaze through me. Don't you know? She kind of looks at me as if I were more to be pitied than censured, but as if she thought I really ought to do something about it. Of course, she's a devilish brainy girl, and I'm a fearful chump. Makes it kind of hopeless. What? George, in his newborn happiness, found a pleasure in encouraging a less lucky mortal. Not a bit. What you ought to do is to... Yes, said Reggie eagerly. George shook his head. No, I don't know, he said. Nor do I dash it, said Reggie. George pondered. It seems to me it's purely a question of luck. Either you're lucky or you're not. Look at me, for instance. What is there about me to make a wonderful girl love me? Nothing. I see what you mean. At least, what I mean to say is, no, you were right the first time. It's all a question of luck. There's nothing anyone can do. I hang about a good deal and get in her way, said Reggie. She's always tripping over me. I thought that I might help a bit. It might, of course, but on the other hand, when we do meet, I can't think of anything else. That's bad. Deuced funny thing. I'm not what you'd call a silent sort of chappie by nature, but when I'm with her, I don't know. It's rum. He drained his glass and rose. Well, I suppose I may as well be staggering. Don't get up. Have another game one of these days. What? Splendid. Any time you like. Well, so long. Goodbye. George gave himself up to glowing thoughts. For the first time in his life, he seemed to be vividly aware of his own existence. It was as if he were some newly created thing. Everything around him and everything he did had taken a strange and novel interest. He seemed to notice the ticking of the clock for the first time. When he raised his glass, the action had a curious air of newness. All his senses were oddly alert. He could even... How would it be, inquired Reggie, appearing in a doorway like part of a conjuring trick, if I gave her a flower or two every now and then? Just thought of it as I was staring at the car. She is fond of flowers. Fine, said George heartily. He had not heard a word. The alertness of a sense which had come with him was accompanied by a strange inability to attend other people's speech. This would no doubt pass, but meanwhile it made him a poor listener. Well, it's worth trying, said Reggie. I'll give it a whirl. Toodaloo. Goodbye. Pip pip. Reggie withdrew, and presently came the noise of the car starting. George returned to his thoughts. Time, as we understand it, ceases to exist for a man in such circumstances. Whether it was a minute later or several hours, George did not know, but presently he was aware of a small boy standing beside him, a golden-haired boy with blue eyes who wore the uniform of a page. He came out of his trance. This, he recognized, was the boy to whom he had given the note for Maud. He was different from any other intruder. He meant something in George's scheme of things. "Hello," said the youth. "Hello, Alfonso?" said George. "My name is not Alfonso." "Well, you be very careful, or it soon may be." "Got a note, air, from Lady Mord. Lady Mord." "You'll find some cake and ginger ale in the kitchen," said the grateful George. "Give it a trial." "Not off," said the stripling. And that, my friends, is all we have time for tonight. We ended with chapter 10. We will continue with chapter 11 tomorrow. This has been Indiana Homes for Story Time. Thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next time.
Please hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the notifications button. Thank you very much.